Well, it's good to see you all this evening, and thank you so much for coming out on this very unpleasant night. It's perhaps a little ironic that this morning we read about the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, a heavy rain came on. And that has been today, hasn't it? Probably needed the rain, but when it comes, it's not always as pleasant as we would appreciate. So tonight we're going to think not about Elijah and prayer, which we looked at fairly thoroughly this morning and spoke about some of those details of what was considered to be part of his prayer. The fact that he went to a quiet place, the fact that he went with faith and confidence in God's word, the fact that he spoke with fervency and spoke with a real sense of coming from his heart, and so on, as we looked at that truth about prayer. Chapter 19 of 1 Kings, I've always felt is a really difficult thing. And it's not an easy chapter to understand. We know what has happened. Elijah has been up on Mount Carmel, and then he ran the 17 miles or so to Jezreel when the rain came, and Ahab went back to Samaria, to the palace, and reported all that had happened on Mount Carmel, how the fire of the Lord had come, how there was no response from Baal, how the prophets have all been killed, and so on. And then, of course, Elijah runs, and he comes from Jezreel, which is up there, you can see, and then down to Beersheba, which we read in chapter 19, and then continues right away down to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, right down in the south of the map there. So it's some journey, but that's where Elijah went. So we leave him from Mount Carmel and we follow him down that routeway this evening. Elijah's triumphs. He was on a high point. He was really on a sort of mountaintop of experience. He'd experienced over the past time God's protection and God's provision. He'd been living in areas where Ahab was trying to find him, and he was kept safe. God had provided for him. Now he stood in front of this vast crowd on Mount Carmel, and God had given him the control of that situation. He courageously stood up to the king Ahab. He killed Baal's prophets. He prayed for fire, and the fire came from heaven. He prayed for rain, and the rain came from heaven. He'd run 17 miles. He had seen God at work. Here was a man who was at the peak of his experience with God. And as he had prayed, as we saw on 3 occasions this morning, God answered his prayer. Here was Elijah, right in the heart of doing God's work, being in God's will, doing what God required. And then Elijah runs away. We ought to recognize, I think, that often after triumphs, there are trials. Life isn't always lived on the mountaintop. We sometimes have to descend to the valley. And that's exactly what seems to have happened to Elijah in this occasion. He'd been trained, we thought about that. How do he trust God when he's by the brook and the ravens are feeding him? Or how he had trusted God away in Zarephath. But sometimes after the training, there come the tests. And Elijah had to experience the testing, the trials after the triumphs and the training that he'd been involved in. And often God uses, people God uses are often the focus of Satan's attacks. I remember a very famous preacher of the Victorian era preached a remarkable sermon, and somebody came up to him straight afterwards and said, "Sir, that was absolutely brilliant sermon." And he said, "I know that. Satan's just told me that." We can be so proud, can't we, of our achievements. And I think Elijah could well have been pretty much part of his achievements. But I was thinking about Ephesians 6, and you know about the armour of God. And Elijah had been strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. He'd seen great things happen as he was strong in the Lord and the power of his might. But that passage goes on to point out that there's enemies. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual places, spiritual powers in high places, against the enemies of our life, against the enemies of God. We are focused against attack. And I believe that Elijah had an attack. So how can we explain this? Well, I'll be honest and say I've never found an easy way of explaining it. But I am going to try and do it in a slightly different way this evening. We kept on emphasizing, and I want to emphasize that time and time again, he is an ordinary man, just like us. And even though God had used him in triumphs in a remarkable way, if we just briefly reminded ourselves, he still was just a man like us. And we can reach the high points, and sometimes we do. In our own life, in our own achievements, in God's service, there are things that absolutely thrill us when God uses us in maybe a private way, maybe in a public way. But sometimes the attacks of the evil one are there. And after that triumph come the trial and the testing. I'm no psychologist. My sister was a consultant psychologist. My granddaughter says she wants to study psychology at university next year. We seem to be a psychological family, but I don't know anything about it at all. But what struck me is this. I wanted to describe what happened with 4 key words which you'll identify with, and if I say something you don't agree with, I can't understand it. I think mentally we've got to recognize that here is a man who's under mental pressure. He's frightened. Ahab's wife Jezebel, when she heard what had happened, she sent a message to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me be ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them." It's interesting to notice that when Ahab's on Mount Carmel, he doesn't in any way tell Elijah to stop doing what he's doing, and he doesn't stop him killing the prophets. But as soon as he gets home and tells Jezebel what's been happening, she gets ferocious and she says she's going to have that man killed. And Elijah runs for his life. And I think we have to say, in that situation, he forgot what God had done for him. He certainly didn't seem to have remembered all the achievements that he'd received from God, how God had protected him. God had been with him. God had not let him down. He forgot what God had done for him. How easy it is, isn't it, to get ourselves into that sort of situation when maybe not fear, but certainly forgetfulness, we forget what God has done and how in every situation we go in, we can rely on him. Underneath are always the everlasting arms, and we can appreciate the truth of that. So mentally, I think he's frightened, and mentally, he's exhausted. His reserves have run very low. He's frail. He's fallible. It's a really tough time. Mentally, he's been up there in front of the whole nation. Mentally, he prayed in front of the whole nation. Mentally, he'd seen God send the fire and then the rain. And now, after such an exciting, such a powerfully exhausting day, he's burnt out. He's really come to a very low point in his life. It's been rightly said, I think, and quite understandably. It comes when we are at our lowest state, fear of the past, present and future. But I thought this was particularly helpful. Bearing the first Good Friday, it must have been the most draining day in the history of a single human being. Puts it on a special point, doesn't it? That all that had happened, it doesn't compare with what the Lord went through on the cross. We know that mentally in every way that was a most awfully difficult, terribly time that we don't fully understand all that he went through. But said the writer in this particular commentary, there couldn't be anything other that he could think of in the whole of Scripture that compares with what Elijah went through. So it's no wonder he's exhausted, no wonder he's burnt out, and we don't know whether he'd had any food or not, but it's pretty likely he was hungry because pretty soon afterwards food is provided. So mentally, this poor man is in a bit of a state. And that explains possibly why he ran for his life when he heard the message that came from Jezebel. The second thought was more like this, spiritually. Always when he had moved from the palace to the brook, from the brook to Zarephath, from Zarephath to Mount Carmel, God had told him what to do. But on this occasion, it seems like he forgot to pray and he forgot to wait. And there's no suggestion in chapter 19, when Elijah was afraid and ran for his life, he comes to Beersheba. He went all that way. And the Scripture always is accurate about these things, I think. And it doesn't say he prayed. And it certainly doesn't say he waited until God told him what to do. He certainly waited by the brook. And when the brook dried up, he didn't suddenly say, what am I going to do now? God said, when it was right time, go out, go Elijah, go to Zarephath. And Zarephath, he stayed there all this time with this widow lady. And just at the right time, God told him to move on. And then God told him to go to Mount Carmel. But he didn't do that this time. There is no suggestion he prayed and waited. And we know that they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up as wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Last verses of Isaiah 40. Wonderful verses. But I don't see that in Elijah. He forgot to pray, forgot to wait. And somehow or other, it seems to me, he thinks he can sort himself out. And when we come to that point, we come to a very sad point indeed, that we think we're stronger, more able, more powerful than coming to our God. And sometimes self can take over in a situation like that. And maybe we could say, temporarily, he'd lost his faith. I think we probably have to do that, because had he had the confidence as he had previously in the different situations, I don't think he'd have run for his life. But because he'd forgot to pray and wait, and maybe was thinking he could sort things out himself, he temporarily was just not trusting God at all. And that can happen to anybody, can't it? And it's happened to all of us, I'm sure. What do? Well, we think we'll sort ourselves out, we forget to pray, and we trust ourselves more than anybody else, and sadly, we get ourselves into a deeper and more complicated mess, maybe. Mentally struggling, spiritually weak, and physically. He's run for his life. We think he ran from the first stage, 120 miles, down from Jezreel down to Beersheba, and then it's another 100, 200 to 250 miles down to Horeb, the mountain of God. I showed you on the map. To move or to cover that distance, he must have been absolutely physically exhausted again. But he's driven by fear, driven by frustration, driven, I think, to a certain extent by foolishness. If only he'd stopped and thought what he was doing, maybe things would have been very different. Now, I think you're probably thinking, he's got his finger into Elijah's giving him a hard time, mentally, spiritually, physically, and maybe I haven't interpreted it quite the same as it perhaps should be. But there's no doubt about it, we learn lessons from what happened that can be a real help to us when perhaps mentally things we're struggling with, or spiritually we're not quite as close to the Lord as we think we should be. We're not really doing what the great hymn says, "Oh, for a closer walk with God." And we sang something about forgive our foolish ways, didn't we? Because it's so easy to do that spiritually. And physically, we can try and put too much into our lives. And some of you are thinking now, well, you talk about the pot calling the kettle black. You were running around all your life, you've been doing it for years. That is true. And how many people have told me over the years, take it life a little bit easier. And there's a lot of truth in that. And I say that to everybody because I know how true it is. Physically, he was weak. Spiritually weak. Mentally struggling. But probably most of all here, emotional. He's despondent. He's convinced that he has failed. You see, chapter 19 follows immediately after chapter 18. And wouldn't it be great if the writer of the record of what's been happening says, and Israel destroyed all the places where there were altars to Baal, and because there were no prophets, they turned to God, they came to God in worship, they followed God's ways, the law was read again, people started to listen to what God was saying and put that into their lives. But it didn't happen. When they cried, "The Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God," I'm sure they meant it, but they didn't practice it. And he's despondent. He's failed. All he had done and all God had used him to do seems to have been failure. And as you read, of course, more after this chapter, you realize that nothing had really changed in Israel at that time. The idolatry was just as strong as it had ever been. He is full of self-pity, and we sort of suggested he's thinking pretty much of himself, and he wants some space. I feel sad, really, that Elijah didn't turn to others. Obadiah was there, close to the king. We know about that from the earlier part of chapter 18. He could have gone to Obadiah and said, "I don't know what to do, but can you help me?" But he didn't seem to do that. He left his servant and off he went on his own. And that is often a serious mistake when things aren't going right. The help of others can be such a blessing to them. And people are prepared to give time, aren't they, to help folks who are struggling in difficult situations, just to sit with them, to pray with them, to support them. It can mean so much. And we just realize how important that is. But Elijah seemed to have ignored any help at all. It's just himself, and just himself in such a way that he thinks, "I just want to give up." And as he prays, he said, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." He wanted to give up. I suppose we've often felt like that. I know sometimes I get a little bit despondent, and sometimes I prefer to be alone and perhaps don't turn to others for help in the way that I should. And I don't think I've ever really wanted to give up, but sometimes you feel the pressure is perhaps more than you could cope with. And coping is not an easy thing, isn't it? And so Elijah, who'd done so much, said, "I want to give up. I've had enough, Lord." Hopefully we won't come to that point. Because if we're mentally trusting the Lord, spiritually keeping close to him, physically not getting too exhausted in the work that we're doing, we won't want to give up, will we? We'll want to continue. And as somebody rightly pointed out, it's not really our place to say, "I'm going to give up," because that's the Lord. When he feels we've done our work, then of course it means that we can just take it easy and go a little bit away from it. But that's not our decision, that's his. And continuing that sort of emotion, he wanted to die. "Lord," he said, "I want to die." He said, I've had enough. He didn't want Jezebel to kill him, but he still wanted to die. And he is really depressed. I use that word very guardedly, because I have an awful memory in my mind. We were going to Pinehurst Chapel some years ago through various topics and various psalms, and I was given a psalm, and I can't remember which one it was, but it was about David being depressed. And I did my best on that. And 2 people came to me afterwards, and I don't usually get too much criticism, but these 2 were quite adamant. You're talking about depression, you don't know the first thing about it. And I had to admit how true they were, because thankfully it's not something that I've had to cope with. But I think it would be right to say emotionally, this is Elijah. The man who said, I've had enough. The man who prays, I want to die. The man who wants to give up. I think that's the only way you could describe depression. And if you see it slightly different, well, I quite understand that. But emotionally, this man is in a bit of a mess, isn't he? His head's all over the place, as we would say in sort of modern terminology. Mentally, spiritually, physically, and emotionally. So what does God do? Well, we can understand it. And an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. And he looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he travelled for 40 days and 40 nights. I think 3 things to just mention here. The first is this. Quite a number of commentators will say that angel was actually the Lord coming to him. And the way that occasionally this happened in the Old Testament days, for instance, the Lord came and spoke to Gideon. When Abraham entertained 3 people, it's quite clear that one of them was the Lord. And here it says the angel of the Lord, the angel of the Lord. And then a bit later on, in what we read at the last verse, and the word of the Lord came to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And verse 11, and the Lord said. So isn't it remarkable that here's a man in the middle of a desert, and to put it in Lancashire words, he was in a right state, but the Lord came to him. The Lord came to him. And that is something very special, isn't it? He knows our situation, and he comes to us. And sometimes when we're going through those difficult situations, the Lord is closer to us than we can ever really fully understand. When life is easy, we don't seem to need that help. But the Lord was right there for him. And God knew exactly where he was. He strengthened him, he provided for him, and was present with him. The Lord came, and he gave him the food and the water that he desperately needed. He gave him the opportunity of sleeping. He provided all that he needed. And maybe in a sense, he watched over him. The angel came back again, and the angel gave again all that he needed. This was rather special, that at this terribly difficult time, the Lord was there. There's an old hymn that says, leaning on the everlasting arms. And Elijah felt that. And one commentator puts it quite graphically. He says, well, when he fell down and got down on the ground and fell asleep, what he didn't realize was this, that underneath him was not the ground, but the everlasting arms of the Lord. And we know that verse in Deuteronomy that says that quite clearly, talking about the everlasting arms of the Lord. The Lord was there for him just when he needed him. And we can't in any way just forget the fact that here he is in the middle of Mount Horeb, miles from anybody, miles from anywhere, and yet God knew exactly where he was. And God had been there before. When Moses is there looking after his sheep, he thinks, why is this bush burning? I better go and have a look. And God speaks to him from the bush. Same place, Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, Mount Sinai. There are 2 interchangeable terms for the same place. And he got right there. Even though he'd run away from Jezebel and Ahab and all that was happening, he'd come to the place where God was, or God came to the place where he was and helped him in a quite remarkable way. There are those who say, well, when we talk about Elijah being in despondent, discouraged, despairing, defeated and depressed, all these, but all of them quite significant, we perhaps are being a bit harsh on him. And another view says very simply this: he needed to flee for his life. He was right to go to God. He did need to recharge the batteries, perhaps taking away some of the mental, spiritual, physical and emotional emphasis that I have emphasized, just to say, well, Jezebel was going to kill him. So the obvious thing was to run for his life. So maybe he did that following the sensible route way of running away from her. And he was right to aim to go to God, where God was. In those days, of course, that Mount Horeb, where Moses had met them, where the children of Israel had been given the 10 Commandments, this was a special place, and he was prepared to travel all that way to meet with God. And if you're getting anything out of this rather difficult passage, it is this: that in difficult situations, we have to come to the Lord. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. And we miss so much if we don't come to him in prayer, don't we? And we don't come and make our way to God as we needed to. And sometimes we realize the importance of that. Peter, for instance, when he denied the Lord and used the sword in Gethsemane when he shouldn't have done, and boasted about what he was going to do and then denied the Lord. And of course, the Lord came to find him in John 21 by the lakeside. And Peter realized that he needed the Lord in his life far more than he had ever done before. And he had to confess 3 times, as you know, that he loved the Lord. The Lord is there for us just when we need him in these situations. We've had quite a difficult year, mainly family problems, but other difficulties as well. But we were in a conference in Bristol about a month ago, evangelist conference, and I don't know how many of them stood up and gave a brief report of their work for the Lord, and they said, this has been a difficult year. This has been a difficult year. We're living in difficult times, aren't we? And times when it seems as though Satan is particularly active, targeting the workers of God and the work of God and the churches of God in different ways. And it doesn't take much for a church to fall apart because of things that have happened within the church, does it? Satan is so pleased when that happens, of course. And we need to realize that it's only God can sort these things out. And only in him can we find all the help that he is. And I don't know how many times I've talked to people who are going through difficult times, and I've said, remember this, our times are in his hands. And even though folks have been taken from them, bereavement, sadness and sorrow, our times are in his hands. And our situation is in his hands. And he knows and he cares, and he was right there for Elijah as he came to that point of saying, what are you doing here, Elijah? As we shall see when we start in November, what happened next. I don't look to Google for my sermons, but I thought to myself, I'll just Google what is the answer to burnout. And this is what it said. The answer to burnout is a multifaceted approach, including taking time off, setting boundaries, and prioritizing self-care activities like sleep, exercise, and healthy eating. Additionally, it's crucial to seek support from loved ones or professionals, delegate tasks, and reconnect with your purpose. Nothing spiritual there in a sense, but some jolly useful common sense, isn't it? Time off, when perhaps we're doing too much, to take a little time off. And Elijah certainly had to take time off before he did the next task that God had for him. Setting the boundaries. He couldn't do what he had done. He couldn't do the new other things, but he knew he had to learn that. Prioritizing self-care, sleep, exercise, healthy eating. Exactly what God gave him in the desert. He had the sleep. He had the exercise of walking on towards Mount Horeb, and he had the food that was provided. Where he lacked, and I felt this was quite certain in Elijah's life, was turning to others to help and being focused on, Lord, what do you want me to do in this situation? But he forgot that, and he turned away from the Lord at that particular point. I guess we all have got different thoughts about this particular section of God's word. But maybe as we look at it, we see the warning signs of how we can get away from God so easily, and the encouraging signs, how the Lord understands, and he brings us back into a situation that we are closer and nearer to him. And that certainly needs to be the case now at this time. We have a very close friend in Africa, and I heard just this last week, he hadn't been to church for weeks. I think there was a bit of difficulty in the church, but he's a strong man, a man who I have the highest regard for, spent time in his house with him, and he's not going to church at all. Difficulties. And our prayer for him would be just this: turn to the Lord. Whatever the situation, try and get things sorted out and leave it in the Lord's hand, because he alone is able and can do more than we could possibly imagine, because he is a great God and we believe in a great Saviour. We're going to sing our final hymn this evening, and we're going to sing The Lord's My Shepherd, and particularly useful because, thank you, Jeremy, for choosing this. I will trust in you alone. I will trust in you alone, for your endless mercy follows me. Your goodness will lead me home. And as we follow through Psalm 23, though I walk the darkest path, I will not fear the evil one, for you are with me, and your rod and staff are the comfort I need to know, and I will trust in you. Let's stand to sing, shall we?